If you think you've already figured out Slay the Spire 2 just because you played the first one, let me tell you right now, this game punishes players who go on autopilot way more. So in this video, I want to go beyond the basics and focus on those insights that truly change how you play, especially if you want to stop just surviving your runs and start actually controlling them. So come with me, because the video is about to start. When I think about playing Slay the Spire 2 as a team, the first thing that comes to mind is that having 4 people trying to do everything at the same time just doesn't work. In my view, the strongest path is exactly the opposite. Each player needs to have a very clear role, because that's what turns the group into something truly dangerous. I really like this idea of having one player focused on generating block for the team, because this type of role almost always seems less flashy at first, but it's what keeps the run alive when the fight starts to get tight. It's that playstyle that might not seem the most heroic, but it makes everyone else perform better. And honestly, I think it's much smarter to have someone consistently protecting the team than watching everyone waste deck space trying to defend themselves half-heartedly. On the flip side, having someone scaling massive damage also makes total sense, because if no one takes on that responsibility, the group gets stuck in that limbo of dealing okay damage without ever actually ending the encounters. And in co-op play, that is usually fatal, because the fight drags on, resources run out, and that overly balanced deck starts showing that it's not actually strong at anything. To me, that's the great danger of average decks. They look safe on paper, but they crumble when the game demands real specialization. Don't try to be 4 lone protagonists. Build a team where each deck has an identity, because when one holds the defense and another becomes a damage machine, the whole group starts working in a much more natural and much stronger way. At the end of the day, I truly believe this kind of organization not only increases your chances of winning, but also makes the run more fun, because every player feels like they are contributing in a unique way. When you look at the Necrobinder for the first time and see that low HP, your first reaction is to think, this character is going to be way too hard to play. And I understand that feeling, because no one wants to start a run already feeling vulnerable. But here is the most interesting point about this character. The game isn't asking you to survive with your HP. It's asking you to use Asti as if he were your true lifeline. Asti acts as an active shield, and the key to keeping the spirit on the board is using cards that apply keywords to other cards in your deck. I think this system is incredibly smart, because it forces you to think differently than you would in a normal run. It's not about healing. It's not about stacking block the traditional way. It's about building a deck that constantly feeds Asti, keeping him active and absorbing those hits that, without this shield, would simply be lethal for the Necrobinder. The most common mistake I imagine people making is ignoring Asti and trying to compensate with other forms of defense, as if the low HP were the real problem. In reality, the low HP is intentional. It's the design telling you that you need to learn to play around the spirit. When you stop fighting this mechanic and start building your deck with the goal of keeping Asti always present, the whole character changes face and starts to make a lot more sense. So the tip I leave you with is this: prioritize cards that interact with keywords on other cards, even if they seem slow or indirect early in the run. Every time you trigger one of these interactions, you are basically recharging your life insurance. The Necrobinder isn't a brute force character. She is a system character. And once you understand that, that low HP stops being a flaw and becomes exactly the pressure that makes her playstyle work. One of the things that catches my attention the most about the Necrobinder is that she doesn't play by the same rules as the other characters, and the Soul's Resource is the clearest example of this. When you're used to the Ironclad, you learn to accept that certain cards simply vanish after being used, and that's fine, because exhaust is part of his rhythm. But the Necrobinder thinks in a completely different way, and understanding this difference is what separates a mediocre run from a run that truly flows. The Soul system works cyclically, and that completely changes how you think about deck building. Instead of permanently exiling power, you are essentially investing in a gear that keeps turning during combat. When you gain souls through specific cards, and use this resource to boost your draw, your combo cards return to your hand much faster than in a conventional run. I find this to be incredibly elegant design, because the character literally feeds on souls to keep functioning, which perfectly matches her identity as a necrobinder. The advanced strategy I see here is resisting the temptation to spend souls randomly. This resource is manipulable, which means you have control over when and how to use it. And playing well with a necrobinder is precisely about knowing how to identify the right moment to trigger this cycle. When you have specific combo cards that need to return to your hand before a decisive turn, using souls strategically to guarantee that access is what creates those sequences that feel unbeatable. My personal read on all of this is that the necrobinder was designed for those who value consistency over explosiveness. While other characters bet on powerful cards that vanish after use, she offers you something much more valuable in long runs: reliability. Knowing that your combos can come back, that the cycle continues, that you aren't reliant on a single perfect turn that completely transforms how you face bosses and plan each floor of the Spire. This is a tip that goes against a lot of people's instincts, and I understand perfectly well why. When you start a run, the natural tendency is to want to protect every single hit point, avoid unnecessary confrontations, and reach the Act 1 boss as healthy as possible. But Slay the Spire 2, just like the original, teaches you that this conservative mindset almost always results in a weak deck that can't survive what comes next. Act 1 elites exist for exactly this reason. They are the most efficient shortcut in the game to get relics that truly define the course of a run. And in the second game, this logic feels even more pronounced, because the power relics you get from these fights have the potential to multiply your strength in a way that no common card or random event can replicate. When you pick up a relic that scales damage, generates extra resources, or changes how your deck works, the entire Act 2 starts to feel more manageable. The core of this tip is to think of taking damage as an investment, and I think this is one of the most important mindset shifts any player can make in Slay the Spire. Losing 20 HP to an elite might seem expensive in the moment, but if it hands you a power relic, you are trading HP, which can be recovered at rest sites, for permanent power that will stay with you until the end. A strong deck with reduced HP wins a lot more fights than an average deck with full health. So what I tell you is this: don't run from elites in Act 1, especially when your deck is still raw and in need of direction. Of course, there's a limit. It makes no sense to walk into an elite with 15 HP and no guaranteed block. But when the situation allows it, facing these encounters with confidence is exactly what separates runs that go far from runs that stall out in the middle of the Spire. This is probably the tip most people need to hear, because it's also the trap most players fall into, myself included, having fallen for it plenty of times in the original game. Every time you finish a fight and that card reward screen pops up with a shiny new option, the human brain wants to take it. It always feels like that card is going to solve some problem, complete something, or make the deck stronger. And sometimes it actually does. But most of the time, what it really does is dilute everything you've already built. The problem with a large deck isn't that the individual cards are bad. It's that the more cards you have, the less chance you have of drawing what you need at the exact right moment. Slay the Spire is a game of consistency before it is a game of brute power. And when your deck goes over 20 cards without a very specific reason, your win conditions start showing up less and less on the deciding turns. That perfect combo you put together gets buried underneath a pile of cards that are good, but not right now. The golden rule I always carry with me is simple. Before picking a new card, the question isn't, is this card good? The question is, does this card serve what my deck is already trying to do? Synergy is worth infinitely more than quantity, and a 1-2 card deck that knows exactly what it wants to do is much scarier than a 2-5 card deck with options for everything. In the second game, with new characters and unseen cards constantly vying for your attention, maintaining this discipline becomes even harder, and that is exactly why it becomes even more valuable. So my personal tip is this: learn to say no. Not to a bad card, that's easy, but to a good card that doesn't fit the current game plan, because that is the decision that truly defines a strong run. Small, synergistic decks reach the boss knowing exactly what they're going to do. Large, varied decks arrive with hope, and hope doesn't block damage. One of the first things I noticed when I started exploring Slay the Spire 2's restructured map is that it requires much more reading before you just start clicking down any path. In the original, you already needed to plan your route, but here, things have been taken up a notch with the introduction of alternate acts and paths that offer completely different experiences depending on what you choose. And this changes everything, because the route you take isn't just about events or elites, it's about shaping the identity of your entire run. The most important point of this tip is to look at the act boss before deciding which path to take. And I think this mindset is fundamental for anyone who really wants to improve. If the final boss punishes the use of skills in a specific way, and you already know that from the beginning of the act, then it makes a lot more sense to prioritize paths that hit shops earlier. Removing problematic cards before they become an actual obstacle is always better than getting to the boss, praying you don't draw that skill you know is going to hurt you. I really like this layer of planning that the new map adds, because it rewards players who stop for a second to think instead of just reacting to what pops up. The verticality of the paths means that every decision carries weight, and understanding what's at the end of the act turns pathing into something almost tactical. It's not just about which path has more elites or more campfires. It's about which path prepares you the right way for what is waiting for you. So what I leave you with is the habit of always studying the boss before taking your first step on the map. It sounds simple, but most people ignore this in their early runs and pay the price later on with a deck full of cards the boss completely neutralizes. When you start planning your route around your final destination, the Slay the Spire 2 map stops being a set of random choices and becomes a tool that you actually control. When the Ironclad was revealed in Slay the Spire 2, the first thing I wanted to know was if he still carried that identity of brute force and self-damage that made him the favorite character of so many people in the original. And the answer is yes, but with an added layer that completely changes the power ceiling he can reach. The upgraded limit break is at the center of all this, and understanding how it works now is what separates a good Ironclad from an Ironclad that simply never stops growing. In the original game, limit break doubled your strength, but exhausted after use, which created a natural ceiling for how much you could scale in a single fight. It was powerful, but it had a clear limit. Now, with limit break no longer exhausting, that ceiling simply vanishes in long fights. Every time you activate the card, your strength keeps growing exponentially. And against the new Act 3 enemies that have more HP and more aggressive attack patterns, this continuous growth makes an absurd difference when it's time to close out the combat. The advanced strategy here is to build your deck with the goal of feeding this cycle consistently. You need reliable ways to generate strength before activating limit break, because the larger your baseline is when the card is played, the more brutal the result of each subsequent use becomes. Cards that interact with the exhaust system remain incredibly valuable because they help keep the deck lean and guarantee that limit break shows up at the right times during longer fights. What I find most exciting about this change is that it finally frees the Ironclad to do what he always seemed to want to do: grow endlessly. In the original, you manage your damage peak. Here, you manage the pace of your growth, and that is much more interesting as a system. If you like feeling like your character is getting stronger with every passing turn in a fight, Slay the Spire 2's Ironclad with an upgraded limit break is exactly the fantasy you've been waiting for. The Watcher has always been that character who seems simple on the surface, but hides an absurd amount of depth for anyone who really dedicates themselves to understanding how she works. Stance dancing is the most powerful mechanic she has, and it remains that way in Slay the Spire 2. But alongside this enormous power comes an equally massive risk, because no character in the game punishes poor planning as immediately as the Watcher does, when you get stuck in the wrong stance with no way out. The tip to remove defend cards early seems counterintuitive at first glance, because everyone thinks of defense as something essential at the start of a run. And I understand that logic, but the Watcher's specific problem is that defend cards with no function within the stance system take up valuable space in the deck, and, more importantly, can show up in your hand right when you need a calm card to exit Wrath. When that happens, you take double damage without being able to react, and that is one of the most frustrating situations in the game. Scry comes in exactly to solve this kind of problem, because it gives you visibility and control over what is coming into your hand. When you use Scry before entering Wrath, you can confirm that you have what it takes to exit the stance before you pull the trigger. This combination of information and planning is what makes the Watcher seem almost unfair in the hands of someone who knows how to use her, because every turn becomes a calculated sequence instead of a gamble. So what I would tell anyone wanting to play the Watcher well is treat her deck like a closed system where every card needs to have a function within the stance cycle. Cards that don't contribute to this cycle, especially generic defends, are the first to go when you hit a shop or a removal event. The Watcher isn't a character for improvising. She's an orchestral character, and when all the pieces are in the right place, she's by far the most powerful in the Spire. There is a very common habit among Slay the Spire players that I myself had to break over time: hoarding potions as if they were trophies. You carry that energy or status potion through the entire act, barely survived by the skin of your teeth, and then reach the boss with it intact as if that were an achievement. But the problem is that a lot of times you don't even make it to the boss, because an Act 2 elite knocked you out halfway there while your backpack was full of resources you refused to use. Act 2 elites in Slay the Spire 2 have a much more aggressive burst pattern than those in Act 1. And that is exactly where energy and status generation potions become more valuable than at any other point in the run. An energy potion on the right turn can let you play those 2 extra cards that end the combat before you take the enemy's heaviest hit. A status potion can neutralize a debuff that was going to destroy your deck for 3 turns straight. These are the moments that decide if the run continues or stops right there. The way I like to think about it is that potions have an expiration date within each run, and that date usually expires before the final boss. If you walk into a tough Act 2 elite with compromised HP and a fight that is clearly going to be long and heavy, using a potion there isn't a waste, it's an investment. Arriving at the boss with 60% HP and no potions is almost always better than arriving with 30% HP and a full backpack, because the boss will give you a lot less margin for error than an elite. So I follow a simple rule. I assess the immediate risk before assessing the future risk. The final boss is a real threat, but they only become a problem if you survive until then. High burst Act 2 elites are the most treacherous checkpoint in the game, and recognizing these moments as the right time to use your potions is one of the most mature decisions a Slay the Spire player can make. In Slay the Spire 2, there is no such thing as a perfect card that works for every boss, every stage, and every situation. The exact same deck that obliterates one enemy might self-destruct against another, and understanding that context is what defines the value of each card, is what separates a player who reacts from one who truly plans. When the Act boss is the Guardian, what you need more than anything is to survive his damage output, which comes in consistently and heavily. In those cases, prioritizing block cards, generating defensive resources, and even removing those skills that don't help you hold the line makes perfect sense. A deck that looks weak in terms of damage can be brutally efficient if it has the right block ceiling to withstand the boss's deciding turn. Speaking from personal experience, I've lost more times because I over-focused on damage than because I lacked strength. On the other hand, when you run into an enemy with thorns, the game flips entirely. Multi-hit attacks, juggling, repeating strikes, all of that turns against you because every extra hit you deal is a strike back against your own health. In that scenario, it's much smarter to focus on 1 or 2 heavy single strike attacks, use maneuvers and resources that boost damage, and drop the cards that only increase your hit count. The deck that previously seemed good no longer is, because what matters now is impact, not quantity. My read on this is that in Slay the Spire 2, the true power isn't in the deck. It's in how you mold the deck around the enemy. Showing up to a boss with the exact same build you used throughout the entire act is a massive risk. The important thing is to always ask, what does this enemy punish? And what does it let me do for free? When you tweak your deck to exploit exactly what the enemy allows and avoid what they punish, the combat changes its face completely, and the game stops being about luck and becomes about strategy.